feel slightly unworthy, but yet deeply touched that I was asked to share some thoughts with you, because I probably knew Jim for the least amount of time of anyone in the room. We really only became acquainted a little over, I guess, 2.5 years ago, when Agnon and Judy became our neighbors, and Jim discovered there was at least one other person that still read and cared about Agnon. And despite the fact I hadn't really thought about it until after the passing, and as is the nature of things, people's dates of birth and dates of death are mentioned in news reports, it had never occurred to me that he was 30 years my senior. Because although he, as he was to everyone, he was a teacher, but he was also just such a gentle friend. He was just such a gentle man. And as he was busy teaching you, he was busy trying to learn from you. And that was the basis for, that's true chavruta, that's true friendship in the real sense. We became connected again because of this mutual interest in Agnon, and he quickly sucked me into this project that he's been involved in, which is the preparation and the translation and the preparation of an annotated edition of Agnon's monumental work, Irum Loa, that he's been involved with, had been involved with Alan Mintz. Hopefully that will still be coming out in one format or another in the next year. And then together we became involved in this little research group that meets in Yerushalayim around things Agnon connected. Beyond Agnon, the only thing we ever really discussed, and which he never failed to mention, was his deep pride in his children, but particularly Eitan, in your family, and not just pride, but envy at your having arrived here and settled here. And our very last conversation, which must have been a few minutes after that last hug, on that night that they left, we met for coffee before going off to the chug. It was about his hopes that maybe somehow they'll be able to come for a long period of time, for a number of months at a time, or maybe permanently. But I wanted to share with you, some of his own writing, because I think it says a lot about what his interests as a scholar were. But of course, as is the nature of these things, I think it says a lot about who he was. He felt very profoundly that the encounter with literature, and the encounter with Hebrew literature in particular, was an essential component, should be an essential component, and he bemoaned the fact that unfortunately it is not an essential component for many Jewish people, but that it has the potential to help us develop spiritually, that it can sharpen our understanding of the human character, that it can help us sharpen our understandings of ourselves, and that the encounter with literature can be a spiritual component or a complement to our principal commitments to Torah. And we should remember that despite all of his many interests, his many very varied interests and talents and endeavors, he principally saw himself, as I think we all did, as a teacher of Torah for many, many, many years. And I suppose we should be mindful of what his activity was during his last hour on this earth, which was engagement in Torah study and Torah teaching. And again, as I described my own relationship with him, my own friendship with him, based on learning and study, so too was that long-standing chabura that he was a part of, and that very last activity. So if you look on this sheet, I included my email, because if anybody's interested, I can email you a copy of these two essays. The first one is an essay that was published, I guess, about 7-8 years ago, conservative Jews. And it's a comparison, it's an analysis of Agnon's impact on Amos Oz. And Jim felt that Oz really captured something about Agnon, but missed something at the same time. And that probably is a function of the fact that Amos Oz, while obviously a very keen reader of literature and, of course, a very talented producer of Hebrew literature, is lacking a certain spiritual insight into what Agnon was. Oz suggests that writing, that creativity, comes out of a wound. And that's true for himself. If you read his memoir, Sipur Alava B'Choshech, the tale of love and darkness in English, which is the text that Jim is analyzing in this essay. So it's true that for Oz it was the suicide of his mother and his upbringing, but for Agnon, who had a very happy life, but for Agnon, nevertheless, there is a kind of wound or a conflict that lies at the center of his work, and that's the tension between tradition and modernity, and how we could possibly bridge this gap. And disagreeing with Oz, Jim felt very strongly that the encounter with Agnon's writings could serve as a bridge and could be a kind of mentor or guide to us, to we who stand on this side of the divide between the old world and the new. But then he admits that Agnon, he writes, Agnon is hard to read. Even Israelis struggle with him, he demands a lot. He does not fare well in translation, which is true, but I hope that you'll see once the translations start becoming published that what Jim was doing as a translator was really monumental in translating Agnon, because he brought to the text both his eye as a literary scholar, his eye as a Talmid Chacham, which is necessary, it's absolutely essential for reading Agnon, and a kind of flair, a kind of writerly flair, a poetic soul. And these things came together to produce what I think are going to be really very, very important translations of Agnon. Agnon really has to be read in Hebrew, nevertheless. He has to be read in Hebrew so he can be heard and understood as the ventriloquist, the unparalleled ventriloquist who gives voice to the full range of the Hebrew literary tradition. And then he makes reference to Eliot, and a few times he called my attention to the importance of reading T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, who also from a different religious tradition, but brings the kind of religious sensibilities, the spiritual imperative that Jim possessed to reading literature. Reading Agnon in that way, he goes on, forces us to see the profound disconnect between the Jewish past and the Jewish present. And I think that what Jim was trying to tell us in his scholarship was that reading Agnon helps us point the way backwards and also forwards. Then he brings this charming quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. There's probably not another article in the canon of tens of thousands of pages that have been written on Agnon where somebody quotes Oliver Wendell Holmes, but here it is. Holmes was reputed to have said, among many other things, I would not give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity, but I would give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And doesn't that just capture something about him? That there's a kind of simplicity which is like synonymous with amharatzus. If somebody doesn't know anything, they tend to be simple. They don't understand the complexity. But then there's the work that you do for years and decades, the struggle, the intellectual struggle, the moral struggle, the emotional struggle, to get through complexity, to understand things in a deep, in a profound way. That kind of understanding that often only comes through teaching others, through introducing the complexity of Yahadut to people that you encounter on college campuses all over the United States. And once you've worked through that complexity, then you enter a different kind of simplicity, which is profoundly different than the simplicity that you have at the onset. So that the simplicity on the other side of complexity, that was Jim. That really was Jim. Then he says about Agnon, that Agnon in his fiction and his life embodies this complexity. And this description that Jim here gives of Agnon is true of Jim himself. He lives and writes in the zone of unresolved complexity, inside the halakhic tradition, even as he knows that its authority has eroded and that its official representatives are less than exemplary. He takes upon himself the full burden of the tension between the difficulties of emunah, of faith, and the obligations of shmirat mitzvot, and he eschews facile resolutions of this tension. And therefore, how can Agnon not be a guide and a model to us moderns? Then, at the bottom of the page, you have something which is unfortunately, as of yet, unpublished. It's something that he was working on in the last few months. It was a piece, interestingly, both of these pieces are titled Then and Now. Odes and Agnon, Then and Now, and Yamim Noraim, Agnon's canonical Days of Awe, this anthology of the entirety of Torah sources on the Yamim Noraim, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And he tries to describe how this book, this Agnon's book, Yamim Noraim, which is not a piece of fiction, I'm sure almost all of us are familiar with it, tries to serve as a bridge to the modern shulgoer on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, back to a bridge to the Machzor, a bridge to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur itself, a bridge back to the tradition which has been cut off. But this kind of recapturing the tradition, to recapture lost time, he makes reference to Proust's Madeline, that kind of nostalgic nugget, that magnet that draws us back to something in our past. But can that be done? Can this be accomplished in our time and place? The question is more easily asked than answered. He describes how Agnon probably with certain assumptions about who the reader would be, and those assumptions may not be true for contemporary Jewry anymore. And the necessity to educate Jews so that people will have that mit'an, that association, the backpack of knowledge that we all ought carry around with ourselves, regardless of where one stands on the denominational stream, on the political stream. But one needs to know something. A Jew needs to know things. And that question of how to provide that knowledge to people who are sometimes very disconnected. That's what he was so occupied, again, principally as a teacher, but also in his scholarship. The scholarship, the kind of teaching on the side that he did at various campuses, wasn't something just to fill the lonely hours. It was essential to who he was. These were all of these different activities that all the speakers had mentioned. Maybe even the beer label translation. These were all part of one personal, professional, spiritual, intellectual persona. And it's what he saw himself doing. As for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, as for Agnon's project of the Yamim Noraim, the original concern that led Agnon to compile Yamim Noraim is still very much relevant. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and the time in between, are not to be squandered. And here he's referring to a story that he and I were working on together. It's a story in Agnon called Pishnayim. And he quotes Agnon himself. Those days and hours of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but it can be the days and hours, we can imagine to be the days and hours of old, the days and hours, the time when tradition was more present than in our days. Those days and hours, once gone, are lost forever. Thoughtful people do not forget even for a moment how special they are. We might say that Jim, who is tragically now lost to us forever. So thoughtful people do not forget even for a moment how special he was.